One is overly excited and one is overly shy.
But not shy enough to jump over. I can make a Rahman black out.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So what we want to do, beginning from tonight, is we wanted to take a very close and reflective look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and derive from that some practical lessons that we can apply to our lives. So we just wanted to be a reading of the seerah without seeing how that seerah impacts our lives, how we can act according to the seerah in our own lives. So that's what we plan to do, starting from today, weekly. Look at the seerah and look at the lessons from each chapter of the seerah. Now, where do we begin? Okay? Any story that you're going to have, the question is going to be, where do you begin? So somebody said, well, you start from the beginning. But when you talk about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, what is the beginning? Do you start from his birth? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And if you start from his birth, are you leaving out important events that need to be addressed, which are really significant, and really his life cannot be taught without those events? So basically, we know that the light of Islam, it emanated from where? Where did it emanate from? Where did it start from? The light of Islam that the Prophet Muhammad came from started from what part of the world? Mecca, Arabia. Okay? And then it fills what? It fills every corner of this dark world and brings what? Light, illumination to this dark world. But it begins before that. The story of this prophet, the Arab prophet and the mercy to all of mankind, begins long before this light starts to emanate and its piercing brightness touches every corner of the world. Long before that, it starts. Because honestly, ya ikhwani wa khawati, if the grandfather of all the prophets, the grandfather of all the Arabs, if he doesn't travel from his hometown to Egypt, and he doesn't interact with a certain individual, an oppressor, tyrant, and the result of that is not the giving of a slave girl. A slave girl who would ultimately become his wife. And then the child that comes from that union. And they're traveling to a place which was uninhabited. If these sequence of events don't happen the way they happen, you don't have what? This light, this prophet, this what? Light that's emanating from what? Arabia. So where do we start? We start like a lot of people in Seerah. They start from Abraham. Okay? The grandfather of all the prophets, the grandfather of the Arabs, they start with Ibrahim. And they tell his story because the story of Ibrahim, his wife Hajar, his son Ismail, the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabs in Arabia are what? They are intertwined. They are inseparable. So we start with Ibrahim, and this was the method of many of the scholars of Seerah, among them Mubarak Furi, in his book or in his rendition of the Seerah, which is entitled Al-Rahiq Al-Maktoub. So we're going to start with Ibrahim. So Ibrahim, he was from a town called Al-Ur in Iraq. What's the name of the town? Al-Ur. Al-Ur in Iraq, in what is nowadays al-Iraq. But that land was a land of shirk, idolatry, disbelief, and tyranny, and immorality. So he migrated. Why did he migrate? Because the land was a land of idolatry, a land of disbelief, a land of tyranny, a land where the beliefs of the people are forced upon you. There's no freedom of religion. You are forced to comply and to live a life of shirk. So he migrated. And his travels first, they took him from Al-Ur to Haran. They took him from Al-Ur to Haran. He settled there for a while. And then he continued his journey, he continued his migration to nowadays modern-day Palestine. Okay? Which is the land which Allah blessed. As Allah says, وَنَجَّيْنَاهُ وَلُوطًا إِلَى الْأَرْضِ الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهَا الْعَالَمِينَ. And we rescued him and his cousin Lot to the land that we had blessed for all of mankind. So that's ultimately where Ibrahim settled. Where did he settle? These are not rhetorical questions. Where did he settle? Palestine.
Okay.
So his journey took him from where? What was the city he was from?
Ur.
Al-Ur, right? Took him to where? Haran. And from Haran he settled in?
Palestine.
Palestine. Perfect. But his journeys, although he settled in Palestine, he continued to what? To travel. And his journeys took him to a few places, among them Egypt. Modern day Egypt. Okay? So one of his journeys took him to Egypt. Honk if you like Egypt. See? All right. Okay, so his journeys took him to Egypt, okay? All right? Took him to Egypt. And Egypt was also governed by a tyrant, an autocrat. Okay? A very oppressive dictator. Tyrant. So that lets you know that that was something very common at the time in which he lived. That you had these people who ruled over others with tyranny. Okay? And the scholars of Islam, they differ about the name of that particular individual. That particular king or ruler of Egypt. Some of them said, his name was Amr ibn Imri al-Qais ibn Saba. They said his name was Amr ibn Imri al-Qais ibn Saba. They said that was the name of the king. Some of them said his name was Saduq. Some of them named him Sinan ibn Alwan ibn Ubayd ibn Alij, and said he was one of the descendants min ahfad Nuh. He was one of the descendants of Nuh. And finally, some of them said he was Fir'aun min al-Fara'ina, that he was a pharaoh or one of the pharaohs. And this was the opinion of Abu Mubarak Furi in al-Rahiq al-Makhtum. Okay? So, when Abraham journeyed, when Abraham went to Egypt, he was accompanied by someone. When Abraham went to Egypt, he was accompanied by someone. Anybody want to guess who that someone was?
His wife.
His wife. What was her name? Sarah. He was accompanied by his wife, Sarah. Okay, and this is significant. Why? Because Sarah was one of the most, if not the most beautiful women in the world at that time. Okay? So they're going to a land ruled by a dictator who feels that anything that his eyes fall on, that he likes, he should what? He should possess it. He should possess it. If I like it, I should possess it. So when they came to the land, some of his minions, some of his subjects, they saw Sarah. And they immediately came running to the king. And they said, there is a woman who has come to this land who it is not proper that she should belong to anyone other than you. So you should summon her. You have to see her for yourself. So rather than summon Sarah, he summoned her escort. Who was that? Ibrahim. So he summons Ibrahim and he asks him, he interrogates him. He says, Man hadi? He said, who is she? So Ibrahim, he knows a little bit something about the Egyptian culture, their religious law, and their social code. And he knows that there are two things in their code. One thing is that a king can only pursue a married woman. He can only pursue a married woman. He can't marry a single woman. He has to marry a married woman. So what he does is, he sees a woman he likes, she's married, he makes the man divorce her, or he kills her husband, and he marries her. Okay? This is their code. He doesn't marry a single woman, he marries what? A woman who's already married. Another part of their code is that a woman's brother has more right to marry her than any other man. You guys with me?
Yes.
So two parts of their religious code. The first part is, what's the first part of the code?
King has to marry a married
The
woman.
king has to marry a married woman. The second one is that a woman's brother has more right to marry her than any other man, including who?
King.
The king. So he knows this about what? Their code. On top of this, he suspects that if he is honest with the king about his relationship with Sarah, one of two things is going to happen. The first possibility is that he is going to kill him. Because the king finds a woman he likes who's married, he does what? He kills the husband. Or he's going to coerce him, force him to divorce her. You guys with me?
Yes.
He knows this about this. This is what he suspects. One or two things are going to happen. If I'm honest about our relationship, then what?
I
Then the
die.
king is going to either kill me or coerce me to divorce my wife. Okay. So the king asks him, Man hadi? So Ibrahim, he says, Hiya ukhti. He says, she is my sister. Okay? She is my sister. So this kind of does what? It kind of blocks the path of what the king's intentions are. But he still wants to what? He wants to corroborate the story. He wants to verify that this is really the case. That what Ibrahim has told him is really true. So what do you think he does next? What do you think he does next?
Ask more questions.
Ask your mom and dad.
He doesn't have the mom and dad with him.
He asked
So let me
her.
ask this question. Whenever there's like a conspiracy to forge a lie, in law enforcement, you know what they do? Let's say you got 5 people who say, this is what happened, this is the way it went down.
Separate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we can't have them together and ask them together, because then what? They'll all say the same thing. But we separate them and we see if their stories match up. So what do you think he did here, Juan?
He separated them.
He summons who?
Son.
He summons Sarah. But when he summons Sarah, at this point he hasn't seen her yet. He summons Sarah, and he's so taken aback by her beauty, he doesn't what? He can't articulate. But he does what? He tries to what? Grab her. Tries to touch her. He's just so taken back by her beauty, he what? He tries to grab her. And when he does that, he falls to the ground. He starts choking and kicking and having an epileptic seizure. Okay? Some of the scholars of seerah, they mention a version of the story in which Sarah, when she entered the chamber, there was a basin of water. So she washed herself for prayer. And she began to pray. And she made a specific dua. She said, Allahumma in kunta ta'lam, anni aminatun bik, wa bi rasulik, wa ahsantu farji illa ala zawji, fala tusallit alayya al-kafir. So she prayed to Allah and she made this dua saying, Oh Allah, if you know about me that I believe in you and your messenger, and I have remained chaste except with my husband, then do not let this believer lay a hand upon me. So he had this epileptic seizure, starts choking, kicking. Okay? So when this happens, he says, Id'i Allah and yutlik yadayya. Pray to Allah, then he what? He lets my hands free, he lets me go. Yursilni, he lets me go. Okay? So he's down on the ground, he's in pain, etc. And she prays, Allahumma, in yamut, yaquluna hiya allati qatalathu, fa'arsilhu, fa'arsalahu Allah. So she prayed then, saying, Oh Allah, if he dies, they will say I have killed him. So let him go. And so Allah released him. Now the people who lived at this time, they have another point or part of their religion or their theology, and that is that they glorify al-jinn. You guys know what the jinn are, right? Who's the most famous jinn? Shaitan, right? So they glorify the jinn. They exaggerate the power of the jinn. And anytime something amazing, something khariq happens, some amazing feat, something that's inexplicable, anytime that happens, they always attribute it to what? To the al-jinn. They attribute it to the jinn. So what does the king say? He starts scolding his guards. And he says, you guys haven't brought me a human being. You have brought me a jinn. He calls her a jinn. Now I want you to notice, when he was having the seizure, he didn't call her a jinn, did he? He said, call upon Allah to release me. So he believed that who was doing this to her? Allah. But then once he was released, he attributed to what? Al-jinn. And this is the way of the mushrikun. When they're in a dilemma, they call upon who? Allah. But when everything's fine, they attribute it to what?
Jinn.
To al-jinn or some other deity of theirs. So, he said, you brought me a jinn. And he says, take her back to what? To Ibrahim. And in this way, Allah saved her from the tyrant. Saved her through this what? Through this miracle. Okay? Alright. But before they departed, before Ibrahim and Sarah, before they left Egypt, the king said, مَا كَانَ يَنْبَغِي لِهَذِهِ أَنْ تَخْدِمْ نَفْسَهَا. It is not befitting that a woman like this should serve herself, should wash her own dishes, should wash her own clothes, should prepare her own meals. It's not proper. So he gave her a gift. Does anybody know what that gift was? Gave her Hajj. Gave her a slave girl, Hajj. Okay? Alright, so in this way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He foiled the plot of this disbeliever, this tyrant, protected Ibrahim and Sarah, and He set the wheels in motion, for what? For that great prophet who would come centuries later to what? To fill the world with light. Wazi ikhwan? So this is the first episode in that story. This is the first episode. And before we get to some of the lessons, we want to talk about some of the ishkaliyat, some of those problematic issues in the story. So the first problematic issue is what? Is that when Ibrahim went to Sarah to explain what he told the king, he said, listen, I told the king that you were my sister. And he's going to ask you about what I said. Okay? And so he said, listen, there are no believers. Okay? Laysa fil ardi mu'minun illa ana wa anti. There's no believers on the earth except what? Except you and me. So technically, you're my sister in Islam. So this is what? This is what you're telling, right? So the question comes, one of the ishkaliyat is what? How could he say there's no believers in the earth when there was who? Lut. As Allah says, وَآمَنَ مَعَهُ وَآمَنَ لَهُ Lut. Lot believed in him. He was a believer. Okay? So what we have to understand is that the word fil ard could have two meanings. Fil ard could mean what? In the earth. The whole what? Earth. but it can also mean in the land, in the place where we are. So when Ibrahim said, Fil ard, he meant what? In this land, in this place. Yes, Lut is in Palestine, but we're here and nobody believes except us. We're the only believers in Egypt. What, ikhwan? So now, Zad al-Ishkal. There's no problem with that, right? There's no problem with that. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is a little bit more problematic. The question is, did Ibrahim tell a lie? Did he tell a lie? And if he did, does that diminish his status as a prophet? Okay, because a prophet has to be truthful so you can trust his message. Is that not so? Okay? And does that mean that telling lies is what? Is okay? Because some people in certain religious communities, from a certain religious tradition, they'll say it's okay to tell a white lie. That's what they call it, a white lie. Because Ibrahim, they'll say, Ibrahim, lie. That's what they'll say. Okay? So this becomes an ishkal. So the first question is, did he tell a lie? Did he lie? No. All right. First of all, what is lying in Islam? What is lying in Islam? Tell me, yeah. Go ahead.
You're not telling the truth.
You're not telling the truth. Good. Perfect. Perfect answer. We're all done. That's a good answer. All right. So lying in Islam, which is a very good answer, it's perfect. Lying in Islam, we say, كل إخبار بخلاف الواقع فهو الكذب. Every time you say something which is not consistent with how things really are, you have done what in Islam?
Lied.
You've lied. Anytime you say, okay, the sequence of events was like this, but the sequence of events are not like that, then that's a lie in Islam. كل إخبار بخلاف الواقع فهو الكذب. Okay. So, this line in Islam, generally it's what? It's prohibited. Generally speaking, it's what? Prohibited. And it's a great sin. As the Prophet said in the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said, إِنَّ الْكَذِبْ يَهْدِي إِلَى الْفُجُورِ وَإِنَّ الْفُجُورِ يَهْدِي إِلَى النَّارِ. He said, indeed, lying leads to iniquity, sin, decadence. And iniquity leads to the hellfire. Anything leads to the hellfire is what? It's haram. So lying is haram. But Ibrahim, he didn't tell a lie. He didn't tell a lie. Why? Because what he did instead, he made a statement. He made a statement which could be interpreted how? It could be interpreted in two ways. Okay? And he intended the least likely of the interpretations. Stay with me. Ibrahim said something which could be interpreted two ways. And what he intended was the least likely interpretation. That in Islam is not called kadhib, it's called a tawbiyah. It's called what? A tawbiyah. When you say something which is true, it's true, the words are true. When you listen to it, it could be interpreted in two ways. The one that most likely is the most likely meaning is what the person you're talking to understands, but you intend the least likely interpretation. But what you said, the words themselves are what? Are true. That's what we call a tawbiyah. Okay? But a Muslim has to always be what? Truthful. But sometimes he might be in a situation where his life is endangered. Or great harm will come if he's very candid and frank. So he can say what? He can say words which are true. But what the person will understand who hears it is one thing. And what he means is something else, and that's called a tawbiyah. That's what Ibrahim was. That's what Ibrahim did, so he did not lie. Okay. Someone will say, well, what do we do with the hadith of Bukhari? Where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لم يكذب إبراهيم إلا ثلاث كذبات. What do you do with the statement of the Prophet when he said that Ibrahim did not lie? Except 3 what? 3 lies. He used the word lie. He didn't use the word tawriyah. What do we do about that? We say the Prophet used the word kadhib, but he meant a tawriyah. He meant lies which are what? That are not really lies, but really it's the truth, but could be interpreted in 2 ways. Okay? All right. We have one more ishkal, ya ikhwan. What does Islam say about slavery? So we got this story of Ibrahim, and he was given, he and his wife, or his wife actually, was given a slave. So what does Islam say about slavery? Is Islam okay with slavery? Does it abolish slavery? And I asked this, ya ikhwan, I mentioned this, why? Once I attended an Islamic Awareness Week. And there was a guy who came just to heckle. He was like one of these Bible-thumping Christians. And he comes just to what? To heckle. And he comes prepared to ask very what? Provocative questions about Islam. So that if there are people who either are inclining towards Islam or they become sympathetic because of what they're hearing, he wants to spoil that. And he wants to say, see, these Muslims are what? They're bad people. And they tell you good things about Islam, but they don't tell you about these what? These dirty secrets, these skeletons in their closet. Like what? Like slavery. And they'll say, for example, Islam never abolished slavery. And then what he did, he dared the speaker, listen to this here, Juan. He dared the speaker he said, will you sign a paper that says that slavery is illegal in Islam? And the speaker, he felt like he was on the spot. And what are the people going to say? So you know what he said? He said, yes, I will sign a paper that says Islam bans slavery. Slavery is illegal in Islam. And it's not. So you guys see that? How a person can, because he doesn't have an answer, doesn't have a way to answer that difficult question, so he just gets what? He gets sucker punched. And fooled into saying something about Islam that Islam did not say. So what does Islam say about slavery? We should know this, because we might meet someone in school, meet someone at work, meet someone someplace who will say what? Oh, see, you guys got dirty, dark secrets. What about slavery? Talk about that. We can talk about it. Yeah, let's talk. Let's sit down. You got a sandwich? You got time? We can talk about it. Okay? All right. So, first of all, the Quran was revealed at a time when slavery was what? It was the norm. And it wasn't just the norm in Islam. It wasn't just the norm in Islam. It was the norm across the world. Everybody did it, regardless of their confessional affiliation, regardless of religion, or their lack of religion, they all practiced slavery. Okay? And so Islam did not come and prohibit slavery right away, because to do so might have what? Prevented many people from doing what? Accepting Islam. Just like Islam didn't prevent what? Alcohol when it first came. Didn't prevent boyfriends and girlfriends when it first came. Because that would have what? Kept a lot of people from accepting Islam. Okay? And Allah, He looks at what? Like we're supposed to do. He looks at what? Taqdeem al-masalih, tawazun. At-tawazun bayn al-masalih wal-mafasid. He weighs between the harms and what? And the benefits. And I'm going to ask you honestly. A Muslim society that practices slavery, is that better, or a non-Muslim society that practices slavery? Which one's better? So it's better for these people to be Muslim and practice slavery than to be what? Non-Muslims and practice it. You guys see that? So Allah, looking at that, He didn't what? He didn't prohibit it outright. He didn't ban it. He didn't make it illegal. But what He did do, subhanahu wa ta'ala, what His deen did, what Islam did, what the Prophet did, is it regulated it. Previously, slavery was not what? Regulated. Is there another deen that can say that? Is there another religion that can say they regulated slavery? They put restrictions on it? Evident. No. But Islam did what? Regulate it. How did it regulate it? It only permitted one form of what? One form of slavery. That's the form when people have wars, and some people get beat in the war, they get conquered, then the people who are still alive, those captives, become what? Slaves. But any other form of slavery, Islam did what? Made it illegal. Made it illegal. You have a free man, and you go to his country, and you do what? You pounce on him. You drag him to your country, you make him a slave. They didn't have that in Islam. That was illegal. And the Prophet spoke about it in his what? In his hadith. Okay, so that type of slavery was totally illegal in Islam in any other form, except what? The form of what? Prisoners of war becoming slaves. Also, Islam encouraged the emancipation of slaves, unlike any other religion. So you find that the kafara, the expiation for so many sins, is freeing what? Freeing a slave. So Allah is telling us indirectly that this is not a good thing, and encouraging us to do what? To emancipate and set people free. So for example, if a man commits a dihad, you guys know what a dihad is? When a man gets angry with his wife and he says, "You are like the back of my mother." Okay? When he commits that, the expiation for that is what? Freeing a slave. If a man has relations with his wife during the daytime of Ramadan, one of the expiations for that is freeing a slave. If a man murders someone unintentionally, inadvertently, one of the expiations for that is what? Atfadal.
It's about the slavery thing. When somebody asks you that, you can tell them. Because like when you're, because in slaves, you know, they a long time ago they whipped people and stuff.
Yeah.
So like it would be haram because you're hurting the person.
MashaAllah.
So like you can basically, it's not going to be bad if you say that because like it's obviously haram because you're hurting the person and making him do stuff that he doesn't want to do.
Jameel, I like that answer. So that's another thing we can add to our argument. That we don't hurt people like that, right? Perfect. All right, so these are some of the examples. The other examples of how Islam encouraged what? The expiation of slavery. So at the end of the day, what we can say, in response to this question about slavery, is Islam didn't abolish it, didn't abandon it, we will admit it. We'll be the first to admit it. But neither did what? Neither did any other religious tradition. Okay? But Islam also doesn't what? Require it. And doesn't say that it's someone's right. Like other religious traditions did. Islam also doesn't authorize the enslavement of what they call so-called inferior races. Islam doesn't authorize that. But other traditions do. Okay? And Islam encourages the abolishment of slavery, whereas the other religious traditions, they don't. So you don't find a religion which encourages the abolishment like Islam does. You might find religionists, people in a religion who do, but you don't find what? The religion doing. And the same verses that they used to, these Christians and other religious traditions used to use to support slavery before, they still what? Exist. They still exist. So this is how we answer the question about what? What Islam says about slavery. We don't say it's illegal or it was banned, or we sign a letter saying that what? We don't believe there's anything called slavery. No. But that's our answer. That Islam regulated it, only allowed one type of it, and encouraged emancipation like no other deen. Okay? Any questions about that? Let's go to the lesson. Abdullah, you got something, Sheikh? Okay.
There's a question.
Abdullah, Sheikh.
Also, just a small point on slavery.
Abdullah.
It was impossible in Islam to be prohibited because when Muslims actually in a war with others, and the others will enslave Muslims, you have actually to enslave them. First of all, you can exchange them. Second, you prohibit them from doing this to you. So actually, it was impossible for Islam just for this particular reason. Because the whole world actually had slaves.
Was involved in trade, yeah.
And you are in a war, you can't say, I'm not going to take slaves. Because you will be taken as slaves if you lose.
Subhanallah.
And you had to have what we call balance.
Mumtaz.
And you can actually exchange. So this is one of the things which was mentioned. Why Islam didn't
prohibit?
It was just as you said, the norm.
It was the norm, yeah.
Right. So you had to be.
And that's another thing too, yeah. You're going to find a lot of things in Islam where people will do what? They'll take modern standards and then they'll project back. They'll project back. So they'll criticize the Prophet Muhammad for marrying a young girl. And they're doing what? They're projecting what? Back. They're saying in our society, our social norms, this is unacceptable. And they project what? Back to a time when it was acceptable. That's a critical point, Ikhwan. You have to wake up to that. That don't take today's norms and then project back and apply them to what? A period where the norms were different. That makes sense, Ikhwan? طيب هتفضل يا شيخ.
I just quote, and then also with the slaves, there were rules for them, like limits, like even like
regulate. Islam regulate.
Like if one commits adultery, it's there's rules for. It wasn't just like slavery that we know is pretty much worse than
the unregulated slavery. A man does whatever he wants with his property.
Right.
A man does whatever he wants with his property. Right. That unregulated slavery did not exist in Islam. All right, let's go now, ya ikhwan wa akhawati, to lessons. Lessons from this first chapter of the seerah. Number 1, tyrants are a reality which Allah has decreed. There will always be tyrants. But the question is, how did the messengers of Allah, how did the prophets who are always our example, the example of how we should conduct ourselves, how did they handle these tyrants? Did they try to topple them?
No.
Did they organize and plan coups against them?
No.
Did they do that?
No.
I'm just asking. They are our example. They handle it with patience and migration rather than armed confrontation. And we can look around at places where people did this and they were successful. But the examples of where they weren't successful are what?
Horrible. There's many and horrible.
There are more. There are more examples of when people tried to do this, they tried to overthrow the ruler, they were unsuccessful. And the consequences, the blood that was spilled, the people who were uprooted, if the people had known that this would have happened, they never would have done those things. How people lost their country, lost their resources. And they were basically became victims of another what? Colonization. People became refugees. Children became orphans. Women became widows. And we know the places we're talking about, Ikhwan. A never-ending war and a ruler, a tyrant who says what? I will burn it down. I will burn it down and I will kill every living thing in order to be king. That's the way of a tyrant. So yeah, you win some, but you lose more. So we have to understand that that's not the way of the prophets. You can do whatever you want to do, but that's not the way of the prophets in dealing with the tyrant. Number 2, al-wudu, in preparation for prayer, was a prescribed practice in the religions of the previous prophets. This al-wudu, like many of the other ritual practices we have, was something which was what? Practiced by the previous prophets and the previous religious communities. Number 3, also a tawassul, the acceptable legislative tawassul, seeking nearness to Allah and the increased acceptability of our deeds through what? Through righteous good deeds. So notice she said, "Oh Allah, if you know from me that I believe in you," which is a righteous deed, "and in your messenger," a righteous deed, "and I have what? Maintained my chastity," another righteous deed, "then do this." So she made a tawassul with her righteous deeds. Okay? An acceptable form of tawassul. Follow.
Is this from the adab of dua?
Yeah, exactly. But what that shows us is that this is something which was practiced long before the Prophet Muhammad came. And this is a tradition passed down from the previous religious community.
So what I was saying, or I guess what I'm trying to clarify is, it's permissible to mention to Allah the good that you've done
in order to get closer to Him and to increase the acceptability of your dua. Yes. Number 4. Allah tests His servants in accordance with the strength of their faith and their status with Him. As the Prophet said in the hadith, "Inna Allah, إِذَا أَحَبَّ قَوْمًا ibtala'ahum." Verily Allah, if He loves a people, He tests them. And He said in the other, okay. So now, where do we get this from? Where in the story do we derive this? Ibrahim, when he went before the tyrant, the Pharaoh, who he feared would kill him, right? Allah tested him with that. Allah tested him with that because of the strength of his faith. Perfect. Next one. Allah supports and protects His awliya, His highly committed servants who are close to Him, with miracles. Where do we get that from? Where do we get that from? The seizure. When he tried to touch Sarah, what? Allah immediately what? Inflicted him with this seizure, so he couldn't get a hold of her. Okay? So Allah protects His awliya with miracles. طيب. Number 6. The hearts of the idolaters are blind to the truth, resulting in very contradictory behavior. The way of the mushrikun is that their hearts are so blind that they do what? They always contradict themselves. Where do we get that from?
The situation
when he had the seizure, he said, ask Allah. But after the seizure, he said, this is from what? From al-jinn. So like we talked about, how when they're on the boat, everything is swell, they call upon who?
Allah.
No, everything is swell, they call upon their deity. But when that boat starts to rocking and they think it's going to tip over and capsize, they call upon who? Allah. طيب. Number 7. One of the Islamic principles is that a Muslim faced with 2 evils or 2 potentially harmful consequences should take the lesser of the 2 evils and incur the lesser of the 2 harms. So we have this concept in our deen that if we're forced to choose between what? 2 harmful things, نَأْخُذْ بِأَخَفِّ الضَّرَرَيْنِ. We take what? The lesser of the 2 evils or the least harmful of the 2 things. Okay? Next one. Allah's decree is at times mysterious and hard to comprehend. As Ali ibn Abi Talib, he said, Al-Qadru Sirrullah. He said the decree of Allah is what? Allah's secret. We don't always understand it. It is possible that we may dislike a situation and experience difficulty and find ourselves in harm's way, but the end result is good. Where do we get that from? Huh? From the Qissa though. From the Qissa though. Where do we get it from? This first chapter.
The Hajar was
the
mother of the
Exactly. That a lot of good came out of them going to Egypt and almost getting killed. A lot of good came out of that because what? That starts what? The wheels turning that would lead to what? The birth of this great prophet who would fill the light, fill the world with light. Wa ikhwan? Alright. Next one. The difference between lying with malicious intent, lying for worldly or personal gain, making an untrue statement for religious reasons, and a tawiyah. That these are what? They're different and each one has their root. So, lying with malicious intent is what? Haram. Lying for worldly or personal gain. Haram. Making an untrue statement for religious reasons. Not for religious reasons. Ibrahim said what? It's true. And, no, he said, now, the tawiyah is the last one. That was true. But when he made the statement, he said, طيب هل أنت فعلت قال من فعل هذا بآلهتنا يا إبراهيم قال كبيره تفضل تفضل
They said, if you say something which is impossible, like for instance, there is a big bucket of water like this, and I'm sitting here, and you came in, I said, what happened? The water is gone. I said, I drank the water. It's impossible. I didn't lie to you because you know this is not happening. So Ibrahim, we call it tahakkum, sukhriya, sarcastic. لقد فعلها كبيرهم هذا. Meaning, they know he didn't do it. They would never believe it. They know he didn't do it. He is a stone. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he didn't lie because he didn't say it in a way that they may believe it. He said, لقد فعلها كبيرهم هذا. He is sarcastic. He is actually saying it. So they say, if you say it sarcastically to prove your point, like Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal when he said, the wood came together and make the ship. You remember the famous story? Why you were late? Abu Hanifa rahmatullah. He said when he was actually milking with the Qadariyah. Then he said, I was waiting on the shore. Then I found this actually wood coming together, and they actually got into a ship. And so it took some time. They said, you're lying because this never happened. He said, you don't believe that the wood can come together to make a shed,
Jimmy.
and you believe that the whole world has no creator.
Hey.
So actually, when you say something which is impossible,
Jimmy.
but you are saying in a sarcastic way to prove your point, Ibrahim a.s. did it also with the stars.
Yeah, exactly.
The stars,
that's another
he
one.
He wasn't worshiping.
So that was the three that the Prophet referred to when he said.
So this is actually, in a way, not lying. So this is what it was a sarcastic point to prove his point.
Jimmy.
Because he may say, if what he said is unbelievable. لقد فعلها كبيرهم. He's sarcastic. He said, لقد فعلها كبيرهم هذا.
Jimmy.
You know what? Your big stone here. He actually did that. So they know that this is not impossible.
I don't know. They had to think about it for a second. They were reflecting. But this is a good answer. But let me say this. This is a good answer. But it doesn't change the fact that
It wasn't true.
أخبر عن خلاف الواقع. He said something which wasn't consistent with what really happened. We call that in Islam what? Kadhib. But he had what? He had a religious... I want these guys to reflect. I want them to think. Can this idol really do this? And if it can't do that, if these idols can't protect themselves, why do you worship them? Also, what do you say about inni? Qala inni saqim. I'm ill. I'm ill. But the point is that he made these statements which we could call untrue for a greater what? A greater benefit. That they will be guided, ultimately, guided to what? A tawheed, and removed from what? A shirk. So in the grand scheme of things, for someone like him, Ibrahim, this would be what? Permitted. That's the point we're trying to make. But that doesn't mean your argument is wrong. Because at the end of the day, what we know is that these prophets are free from what? That blameworthy kadhib. That haram kadhib. That's what we want to agree on at the end of the day. So whether you take that explanation, or this explanation, or a little bit of both, at the end of the day, what Ibrahim did is not the prohibited kadhib. It's not the blameworthy kadhib. It's not the sinful kadhib. Tafadhal, Sheikh, you wanted to say something. Tafadhal. Wa alaikum salam.
If you look at the story of Ammar and the Prophet when the Quraysh were beating Ammar, then he went to the Prophet. Then the Prophet asked him to say, to curse.
Ahsant, yes.
So when Ammar said that, he was not saying the truth. But the Prophet told him to say that.
And said it for what reason? For a religious reason. Right?
So he was probably because he was beaten. Not because of religious. Maybe he was scared of his life. Not necessarily. So maybe both. But he did not say the truth. So that's maybe to predict what we are seeing.
So you guys see the point though. That we have something called lying with malicious intent. Mm-hmm. We all agree that's what? Haram. Lying for worldly or personal gain. Haram. If you put what Ammar did and what Ibrahim did in the third category, untrue statement for religious reasons, it's got to be what? Halal. Especially for people like that, in those situations that they were in. We're not talking about people who want. We're not talking about people who they're late for work because they wanted to. I don't know. They wanted to have some cereal before they left, so that put them, back 5 minutes. They get to work. Why are you late?
Right.
I was, there was an accident on I-26. Right? So now, this is not for religious reasons. Okay? Tafadhal, Sheikh.
My point is that Ammar, from the story, it seems that he lied. It was not Tawriya like Ibrahim.
Right.
So he lied. So he did not say the truth.
Understood. Like, last but not least, Sheikh Juan, Islam did not outlaw slavery, but it did pave the way for its abolishment, and no other deen can say that. No other deen, no other religion can say that. Any questions, comments, complaints, or critiques? Questions, comments, Abdullah.
Okay, I'm going to try to take it a step at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So if this third category, making the untrue statement for the religious reason, is acceptable, so then why, when you go back to, you're saying the hadith where the Prophet said Ibrahim lied, and he said, oh, well, he meant to say this. Because all the time when I hear people talk about Arabic, they always say in the Arabic language, like each word is more specific than in English, and like is meant directly to mean that.
Okay.
So if it's okay to say something untrue for a religious statement, why go and say, oh, well, the Prophet said this, but he meant to say that, when it can lead down a slippery slope? So now any hadith you can say, oh, well, he meant to say this, or he meant to say that.
Well, no, because, again, Ibn al-Qayyim, he says this. He says, al-alfaz qawalib al-ma'ani. He says that these words, they are basically an envelope, a vessel that carries what? Meaning. If I send you a letter, you get the letter and it's in an envelope. And you say, oh, mashallah, a letter from Abdullah. You rip it open. Do you take the contents and throw them in the trash and read the envelope? Huh? What matters? The message in the letter, the contents. So Ibn al-Qayyim, he says, one of the mistakes that people have made that's causing them to go astray is that they get too caught up in what? The literal meaning of the word. And they don't consider the context in which it was said. Okay? And other factors that will help you determine the meaning. You follow me? So part of our job as people who study the text is to look beyond the word and to consider those factors so we draw the right conclusion. Otherwise, if we become very literal in our interpretation, we err. I'll give you a good example. I hope you'll understand this. Allah says, وَعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيكَ الْيَقِينُ. He says, worship your Lord until certainty comes to you. Okay? So now the word certainty, literally, if we take it literally, it means you become certain of what? Of the oneness of Allah, the certainty of a tawheed, the certainty of His right to be worshipped alone, whatever. So if you reach that stage, you don't have to do what? You have to worship Allah anymore. And some people actually understood it like that because they took the word literally. But the people who went beyond that and said we have to consider what? Other texts that tell us that you can never stop worshiping Allah until you die. So then they said what Allah meant by yaqeen here is not certainty, but He meant al-maut. He meant death. So Sahih, what you're saying is that the Arabic language is daqiq. It is a very precise language. There's no question about it. It's very precise. Anybody studies it, they see that they have, for example, take the date. Take the date, right? Open the date and you have that pit. Well, you have the pit, you have a name for it. Then there's like a thin sheet, there's a name for that. Then there's like a what? There's a slit, there's a name for that. It's so precise, unlike any other language, no question about that. But that doesn't mean that now we just take the word and don't look at these other factors which will determine what Allah intended by the word. Does that make sense? So in the case of when the Prophet said, use the word lie, we take what? Into consideration the context in which he said, the story that he was referring to, and other factors that we know about the prophets, that they can't what? They can't tell a lie with malicious intent. They can't tell a lie for worldly purpose gain. So he must have meant something else, and other than what? The meaning that typically comes to what? Our mind.
But even without interpreting that, if we just leave it as what he said, saying that Prophet Ibrahim lied, the hadith would still be correct, right?
Yeah, the hadith is correct, but how do we interpret it? How do we understand it? We have to go beyond the word and look at these other factors which will tell us what the Prophet intended by the word. If we just leave it at face value, we can go astray. Like the example I gave you, worship your Lord until certainty comes to you. Okay? Atfallah.
Al-hasad is haram.
Jamil.
But the Prophet ﷺ in one hadith said, La hasada illa ithnatayn.
Ahsan.
And here he didn't mean the hasad.
وقصد أي شيء الغبطة.
So in Arabic, can use one word, meaning another word.
The context will dictate.
The context, right, will explain what the meaning is.
Did you guys understand what the brother said? He said that the Prophet
said in English.
Okay, so he said that in general, we have many texts that tell us that hasad, jealousy, envy, is prohibited in Islam. But he said there's a hadith where the Prophet said there's no jealousy except in three things. Legalizing it in three cases. Okay? But he said what the Prophet intended is a type of jealousy called what? Ghibta, which is different from envy. Ghibta is when you want something that the person has, but you don't want them to lose it. Whereas hasad is I want what he has and I want him to lose it. So the Prophet used the first word, but intended the second one we know from what? From the other nusus, the other text. That's what tells us, that's what helps us, and that's wallahi ikhwan. That's the job of the scholar. And that's why the average person just can't pick up a hadith, read it, and say, okay, and move out on it. And we see people do this. I work in prison. I see it all the time. And people just read a hadith, they think they know what it means just based upon the literal meaning of the words, without studying the context in which it was said. And other texts which further do what? Clarify what was intended. And they end up going astray. And if you look at study Islam, study the deviant groups, how do they go astray? They all say we follow Quran and Sunnah. And they all support what they say with Quran and Sunnah. But the problem is what? Interpretation.
They don't deal with the shock.
Fi shay? Shall we close out?
Yes.
طيب هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا